They say the most dangerous people are never the ones who want the galaxy to remember their names. They are the ones who quietly pray that everyone forgets them. The words drifted through the dim command chamber of the Corsair Coalition flagship as dozens of officers stood frozen around a holographic star map glowing in pale blue light. No alarms were sounding. No weapons had been activated. Yet the silence pressing against the steel walls felt heavier than any battle they had ever survived. At the center of the room, a single transmission rotated above the table. A civilian immigration record. A routine diplomatic update. Nothing about it should have mattered. The image slowly resolved into the face of an ordinary human man wearing a simple gray work jacket. His light brown hair was neatly combed. His expression was calm, almost forgettable. A wedding photograph followed. Standing beside him was Princess Lysara Vale of the Asterian Empire, her sapphire skin illuminated by the soft, golden glow of the royal gardens behind them. She looked composed, graceful, every inch the daughter of one of the oldest royal houses in known space. The officer controlling the display swallowed hard before speaking. Identity confirmed. Ethan Carter. Current residence, Imperial Capital District. Nobody answered. An older commander with silver scars running across one side of his face stared at the photograph for several long seconds before slowly removing his glasses. His breathing became noticeably uneven. A younger captain frowned, confused by the strange reaction spreading across the room. "It is only one human," he said quietly. "Why does everyone suddenly look afraid?" The older commander did not take his eyes off the image. "Because if that identification is correct," he whispered, "then history just walked back into the galaxy wearing a wedding ring." The room became impossibly still. Even the gentle vibration of the ship's engines seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those words. No one laughed. No one questioned him. They simply continued staring at the smiling human beside the alien princess. The captain leaned closer toward the hologram. "He looks harmless." The commander's expression hardened. "That is exactly why you are still alive enough to say those words." Millions of miles away, beneath a bright morning sky on the peaceful world of Asterian Prime, Ethan Carter carefully trimmed the branches of a flowering tree outside a quiet stone residence overlooking crystal lakes and rolling silver gardens. The air carried the scent of blooming sky lilies while distant birds circled above marble towers that reflected the early sunlight. There were no soldiers around him, no armored escorts, no symbols of power. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. Gardening gloves covered his hands. Every few moments he stepped back, studying the shape of the tree with the patient concentration of someone who genuinely enjoyed simple work. Inside the nearby residence, Princess Lysara watched him through a tall window while sipping warm herbal tea. She had spent months trying to understand the man she had married. Their union had been arranged to strengthen trust between humanity and the Asterian Empire. It had been discussed by diplomats, celebrated by worlds, and analyzed by political scholars across dozens of systems. Yet behind the enormous political significance stood one surprisingly ordinary husband. Ethan preferred repairing household machines over attending royal banquets. He remembered every gardener's name, but often forgot where he left his own reading glasses. He cooked breakfast himself whenever the palace staff took a day off. He apologized whenever he accidentally tracked dirt across polished floors. Sometimes Lysara found him feeding tiny feathered creatures from the palm of his hand, while quietly humming old songs from Earth that she had never heard before. She respected him. She trusted him. But if she were completely honest with herself, she also believed one thing with absolute certainty. Her human husband was perhaps the gentlest man in the entire galaxy. She smiled faintly as Ethan looked toward the window and raised one gloved hand in a cheerful wave. She waved back without realizing that, at that exact moment, somewhere beyond the stars, ships that had remained hidden for years were beginning to change course toward Asterian Prime after hearing one impossible name spoken aloud once again. The palace had been designed to impress ambassadors, kings, and admirals, yet Ethan Carter seemed completely unaffected by its grandeur. Every morning followed nearly the same rhythm. He woke before sunrise, brewed fresh coffee from carefully imported earth beans, opened every window facing the eastern gardens, and quietly listened as the first birds greeted the day. The ancient palace servants had stopped questioning his habits months ago. Some even began adjusting their own schedules around them because, as one elderly caretaker admitted with a warm smile, the entire residence somehow felt calmer after the human had arrived. Princess Lysara noticed these small changes long before anyone else did. The gardeners smiled more often. The kitchen staff laughed while preparing breakfast. Even the palace security officers seemed less tense during their shifts. None of those things had happened because Ethan ordered anyone to behave differently. He simply greeted every person by name, thanked them sincerely, and treated every conversation as though it mattered. Such behavior puzzled Lysara more than any military strategy ever could. Among the royal families of the Asterian Empire, respect usually flowed downward through rank and title. Ethan seemed to believe respect belonged to everyone before it belonged to anyone. That morning she found him kneeling beside a maintenance drone whose tiny mechanical arm had stopped moving. Its silver shell reflected the warm sunlight spilling across the marble courtyard. Ethan held a compact repair kit while speaking to the little machine as if it could understand every word. "You have been working harder than I realized, little buddy," he said with a soft chuckle. "Let us see what is bothering you." A young palace attendant paused nearby, trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile. "Your Highness," she whispered to Lysara, "does he always talk to machines?" Lysara folded her arms while watching through the open balcony doors. "Every day. Do they answer?" The princess smiled faintly. "Apparently they do. At least they work again afterward. Only a few minutes." Later, the tiny drone emitted a cheerful electronic tone before lifting itself into the air with renewed stability. It circled Ethan twice before flying back toward the maintenance wing. Ethan looked genuinely pleased with the outcome, brushing dust from his hands before walking toward the greenhouse carrying a basket of fresh vegetables he had picked himself. Lysara followed him at a distance. She had learned that observing Ethan without announcing herself often revealed the most interesting parts of his character. He never seemed aware that anyone important might be watching. He behaved exactly the same whether standing before senators or speaking with children visiting the palace gardens. Inside the greenhouse, warm air carried the scent of rich soil and flowering herbs. Ethan carefully inspected rows of tomatoes, peppers, and climbing beans growing beneath transparent crystal panels. "They are growing faster than last week," he murmured with obvious satisfaction. One of the elderly gardeners nodded proudly. "The new irrigation pattern you suggested has doubled the harvest." Ethan laughed quietly. "I only borrowed the idea from a farmer back home in Kansas." He would probably laugh if someone called it advanced science. Lysara had heard stories about human technology, human explorers, and human soldiers, but Ethan rarely spoke about any of those subjects. Instead, he talked about neighbors, teachers, mechanics, nurses, and farmers. Ordinary people seemed to occupy the center of every memory he cherished. It fascinated her. During lunch, she finally asked the question that had quietly lingered in her mind for weeks. "Ethan, were you always this peaceful?" He looked up from slicing fresh bread and smiled with gentle confusion. "I suppose so. I always preferred fixing things over replacing them. Even as a child, especially as a child. My mother used to say I could never walk past something broken without trying to repair it." Lysara nodded slowly, convinced more than ever that the galaxy had misunderstood humanity's reputation for resilience. Whatever stories existed beyond their borders surely belonged to other people, not the quiet man sitting across from her, who carefully spread homemade jam onto warm bread before placing the larger slice onto her plate without saying a single word. Outside the palace walls, however, encrypted transmissions continued racing silently between distant star systems, and with every passing hour more hidden vessels adjusted their course toward Asterian Prime, guided not by hatred for an empire, but by the unsettling certainty that Ethan Carter had finally been found. That afternoon, the palace welcomed representatives from 12 allied worlds, transforming its quiet marble halls into a sea of colorful ceremonial robes, polished uniforms, and gentle conversations spoken in dozens of languages. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm amber light across the enormous reception gallery, while musicians played soft orchestral melodies from a balcony overlooking the central hall. Princess Lysara moved gracefully from one delegation to another, fulfilling the endless responsibilities expected of the daughter of an imperial dynasty. Ethan remained close enough to accompany her when needed, yet never attempted to become the center of attention. If anything, he seemed far more interested in making certain elderly diplomats found comfortable chairs or helping a server carry an overloaded tray than discussing politics. More than once Lasara caught foreign officials studying her husband with puzzled expressions. They had clearly expected a celebrated human representative filled with speeches and confidence. Instead, they found a man thanking the kitchen staff for lunch and quietly wiping a small water spill before anyone slipped on the polished floor. During the reception, an elderly ambassador from the Orion Trade Assembly accidentally dropped a carved crystal cane while rising from his seat. Before any royal attendants could react, Ethan crossed the room, retrieved the cane with both hands, and returned it with an easy smile. "Take your time, sir," he said warmly. "These floors are beautiful, but they do not forgive fast footsteps." The ambassador laughed, accepting the cane with visible appreciation. "Young man, in my 180 years, very few people have remembered that old age is slower than pride." Ethan only shrugged. "My grandfather taught me that lesson when I was 8 years old." The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it quietly spread through the gathering. Lasara noticed whispers passing among nobles who had never before seen a royal consort behave with such unaffected humility. She found herself wondering whether kindness required courage in ways titles never could. Later, as the formal banquet concluded, she and Ethan escaped onto a wide terrace overlooking the lakes beyond the palace. Evening had settled gently across Asterion Prime. 3 small moons reflected across the calm water, while glowing trees painted silver ripples beneath the breeze. The celebration continued behind them, but outside there was only peaceful silence interrupted by distant birds returning to their nests. Lasara rested both hands against the smooth stone railing. "Do you ever regret agreeing to this marriage?" she asked quietly. Ethan considered the question longer than she expected. "No," he answered at last. "Do you?" She looked toward the stars before smiling faintly. When the agreement was announced, everyone expected political tension. Instead, they keep asking why my husband spends more time planting vegetables than giving speeches. Ethan laughed softly. "Vegetables are easier to negotiate with." She rolled her eyes with amused disbelief. "You always find the simplest answer." "Sometimes the simple answer is the honest one." His voice remained calm, almost effortless, yet something about those words lingered in the cool evening air. Lasara studied his face beneath the pale moonlight. There was no trace of ambition hidden behind his smile. No hunger for influence. No desire to command attention. If anything, Ethan appeared happiest during moments when nobody expected anything extraordinary from him. She wondered what kind of life had shaped someone into becoming so content with ordinary happiness. Before she could ask another question, a palace communication drone floated silently onto the terrace. Its blue indicator light pulsed with unusual urgency. "Princess Lasara," the mechanical voice announced politely. "An encrypted diplomatic vessel has arrived ahead of schedule requesting immediate audience with the Imperial Security Council." Lasara frowned. "From which system?" The drone hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. The vessel declined to identify its government affiliation. However, their captain requested that one message be delivered without alteration. Ethan slowly turned toward the hovering drone, his relaxed expression unchanged. The mechanical voice continued. The captain said only this: "Tell Ethan Carter, an old debt has finally found its way home." For the first time since Lasara had known him, Ethan did not smile. He simply stared into the growing darkness beyond the palace gardens, while somewhere far above the peaceful world, an unmarked starship settled silently into orbit. The message lingered over the terrace long after the communication drone quietly drifted away, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the flowering trees below. Princess Lasara slowly turned toward Ethan, expecting confusion or perhaps annoyance at the strange interruption. Instead, she found something she had never seen before. His expression had not hardened. It had not become fearful. It had simply become very still, as though an invisible door inside him had quietly closed. He continued looking toward the stars without speaking. "Do you know who sent that message?" she asked after several moments. Ethan drew a slow breath before answering. "I am not sure." It was an honest sentence, yet something about the pause before it felt incomplete. Lysara had spent her entire life reading ambassadors, generals, and politicians. She understood the language of hesitation almost as well as spoken words. Before she could ask another question, footsteps echoed across the marble floor behind them. Imperial Chamberlain Varric approached with unusual urgency, accompanied by two senior security officers. Their normally composed faces carried unmistakable concern. "Your Highness," Varric said, offering a respectful bow. "The visitors have agreed to remain aboard their vessel, but they insist that the message was intended only for Mr. Carter." Ethan nodded politely. "Did they request a meeting?" "No." Varric looked genuinely puzzled. "That is what troubles us. They transmitted the message, confirmed its delivery, and then simply waited." Lysara frowned. "They made no demands?" "None. No diplomatic requests. None." Ethan quietly folded his gardening gloves and slipped them into his jacket pocket before speaking. "Then perhaps they are waiting to see what I choose to do." The Chamberlain looked even more confused. "You speak as though you recognize their behavior." Ethan offered a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. "People reveal a great deal through patience." The conversation ended there because Ethan politely excused himself, claiming he wanted to check the irrigation system before tomorrow morning. Lysara watched him disappear down the garden path beneath rows of glowing lanterns, his steady footsteps echoing softly against polished stone. Something about the ordinary excuse felt strangely deliberate. She remained on the terrace until the stars brightened overhead, unable to shake the quiet unease settling in her thoughts. The following morning the palace resumed its familiar rhythm. Servants prepared breakfast. Gardeners tended flowering vines climbing the eastern walls. Maintenance drones floated through bright corridors carrying tools and supplies. Ethan behaved exactly as he always had. He greeted every employee by name, repaired a loose cabinet hinge in the library, and spent nearly an hour helping young apprentices assemble a small educational telescope in the science courtyard. Anyone observing him would have concluded that the previous evening had never happened. Yet the palace itself had changed. Security patrols became noticeably more frequent. Additional orbital scans appeared on tactical displays throughout the command wing. Diplomats whispered more quietly whenever Ethan entered a room, often stopping their conversations altogether until he walked away. Shortly before noon, an unexpected visitor arrived through the Eastern Service entrance. He wore plain civilian clothing beneath a weathered traveling coat and carried no visible weapons. His dark gray skin and silver eyes marked him as a citizen of the distant Corvin systems. Although his posture suggested years of disciplined training rather than ordinary commerce, palace security immediately intercepted him. The visitor offered no resistance, calmly presenting a diplomatic identification chip while requesting only 5 minutes with Ethan Carter. Curious officials escorted the stranger into a modest reception chamber instead of the grand audience hall. Ethan entered alone a few minutes later carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. "You came a long way," he said warmly, placing 1 cup on the table. The visitor accepted it with slightly trembling hands. He stared at Ethan's face for several seconds before whispering almost to himself, "You really stayed gone." Ethan remained standing. That was the plan. The visitor let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Most ghosts disappear. You became someone's husband." Ethan finally smiled, gentle and familiar once again. "Life surprises all of us." The visitor lowered his eyes toward the untouched coffee. "Not the galaxy. The galaxy has been searching for you for 9 years." His hands tightened slightly around the warm cup. "Some hoped they would never find you. Others prayed they would." He slowly looked back up. "But none of us imagined we would discover you tending flowers in an imperial garden." Ethan answered with calm simplicity. "Neither did I." Outside the chamber, Princess Lysara had not intended to overhear the conversation, yet as those final words reached her through the partially open doorway, one quiet realization settled into her heart. She had married a man whose past was not hidden because it was shameful. It was hidden because an entire galaxy had never stopped looking for him. The visitor remained inside the reception chamber for less than 15 minutes. Yet when he finally departed through the eastern courtyard, the atmosphere across the palace felt noticeably different. No announcements were made. No official reports were distributed. Still, experienced soldiers and longtime servants alike sensed that something unseen had shifted beneath the calm routines of the royal residence. Princess Lasara found Ethan exactly where she expected him to be, standing inside the greenhouse. While carefully tying a young climbing vine to a wooden support, warm sunlight filtered through the crystal ceiling, casting soft patterns across rows of fresh herbs and flowering plants. He looked exactly as he had every other morning, patient, focused, and completely at peace. Yet now she wondered whether she had ever truly known the man she was watching. "May I ask you something?" she said softly as she stepped inside. Ethan looked over his shoulder and smiled. "You never need permission." She walked beside him, gently brushing one hand across fragrant basil leaves before choosing her words. "The man who visited you. He looked relieved that you were alive." Ethan nodded once. "Yes." But he also looked frightened. Another quiet nod. "Yes." "Of you?" Ethan carefully adjusted another vine before answering. "Not exactly." She waited. "Then of what?" He remained silent long enough that only the distant hum of irrigation pumps filled the greenhouse. Finally he spoke. "Sometimes people become afraid of memories, even good ones." The answer was thoughtful, but it explained almost nothing. Lasara studied his face, searching for signs of discomfort, guilt, or regret. She found none. Instead, she saw quiet acceptance, as though he had spent years making peace with questions he knew would eventually return. Before she could continue, a palace aide hurried into the greenhouse, carrying a secure communication tablet. "Your Highness," he said with a respectful bow. "Priority intelligence from the Imperial Observatory." Lasara accepted the device. As the encrypted report unfolded across the screen, the warmth of the greenhouse suddenly felt very far away. During the previous 12 hours, long-range sensors had detected an unusual increase in civilian traffic entering nearby star systems. Individually, none of the ships appeared suspicious. Cargo transports, exploration vessels, private yachts, commercial freighters. Yet together they formed a pattern that experienced analysts could not ignore. Nearly every vessel had quietly altered its flight path towards sectors surrounding Asterion Prime. "Coincidence?" Lasara asked. The aide hesitated. "Our analysts no longer believe so." Ethan glanced briefly toward the report before returning his attention to the young plants. People tend to gather when they hear old stories becoming true. The aide looked confused. "Mr. Carter?" Ethan simply smiled. "Nothing." By late afternoon, the Palace Intelligence Division had begun receiving similar updates from allied governments. Merchant guilds reported unfamiliar buyers purchasing enormous quantities of fuel. Independent observatories noticed encrypted communications passing between ships that had never previously operated together. Insurance companies quietly suspended coverage for several high-risk trade routes without publicly explaining why. None of these events appeared directly connected, yet together they painted the outline of a much larger picture. Inside the Royal Library, senior advisors debated possible explanations around a circular holographic display. Some suspected an economic crisis. Others feared political instability within distant territories. One elderly strategist simply stared at the growing web of moving lights before murmuring, "This does not look like preparation for war. It looks like preparation for witnessing something." His words lingered uncomfortably around the room. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the evening helping palace children build a wooden birdhouse in one corner of the garden. They laughed whenever he accidentally drove a nail slightly crooked before patiently removing it and trying again. Lasara watched from the balcony above. The contrast almost felt impossible. Every intelligence report suggested invisible forces were slowly converging upon their world. Yet the man standing at the center of those mysteries was happily listening to a 7-year-old explain why blue birds preferred larger windows. As sunset painted the marble towers with warm shades of gold and crimson, one final encrypted message arrived from the Imperial Observatory. This report contained no speculation, only verified numbers. 43 unidentified vessels had entered neighboring sectors during the last 6 hours. None had requested docking permission. None had approached the planet. Every one of them had simply stopped at extreme distance, maintaining silent observation as though waiting for someone else to make the first move. Lasara slowly lowered the report and looked toward Ethan across the glowing gardens below. He laughed gently as one of the children proudly held up the finished birdhouse. For a fleeting moment, she wished the entire galaxy could see only that version of him. Deep inside, however, She could no longer ignore the growing certainty that the universe had not come searching for a warrior. It had come searching for the quiet man who never wanted to be found again. Before dawn, the palace felt unusually awake. Lights glowed inside the Imperial Security Wing hours before sunrise, and quiet footsteps echoed through corridors that normally belonged only to gardeners and cleaning staff. Princess Lysara stood beside a panoramic observation window overlooking the eastern horizon, watching the first pale colors spread across the lakes below. Behind her, a holographic display continued updating the same unsettling information. 43 unidentified vessels had become 57 overnight. None transmitted threats. None violated Imperial space. They simply waited with remarkable discipline, maintaining identical distances as though following an invisible rule understood by every captain present. "This is no ordinary gathering," Chamberlain Varric said softly. "They are not positioning themselves for attack. They are positioning themselves for history." Lysara folded her arms. History centered around one man. Varric nodded without speaking. That answer alone was unsettling enough. Ethan entered the chamber carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, wearing the same simple gray sweater he had worn countless mornings before. He handed one cup to Lysara with an easy smile. "You skipped breakfast again." She accepted the cup almost automatically. "How can you possibly stay this calm?" Ethan looked through the enormous window toward the quiet gardens below. "Because nothing has actually happened yet. 57 unidentified ships are surrounding neighboring sectors. They are watching. Does that not concern you?" He took a slow sip before answering. "Concern helps when it becomes preparation. It does not help when it becomes fear." His calmness somehow made everyone else feel even less certain. Hours later, while Lysara attended an emergency council session, Ethan quietly excused himself from the palace. No guards followed him. No announcements marked his departure. He simply walked across the dew-covered gardens toward an older section of the royal estate that few visitors ever explored. The path wound beneath ancient silver trees whose branches filtered soft morning light across weathered stone walkways. At the end of the trail stood a modest storage building constructed decades before humanity and the Asterian Empire had signed their alliance. It had once served as an observatory maintenance workshop before newer facilities replaced it. Most people considered it little more than an abandoned utility structure. Ethan unlocked the old wooden door with a small brass key he carried on his personal key ring. The hinges opened with a familiar creak. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight cutting across the quiet room. Shelves lined the walls, holding ordinary tools, gardening equipment, spare irrigation pumps, and neatly organized storage boxes. Nothing appeared unusual. Ethan walked calmly toward the back wall where an old workbench stood beneath a faded earth calendar that had not been turned for years. He rested one hand against the wooden surface. For several silent seconds, he simply stood there, almost as if remembering another lifetime. Then he reached beneath the bench and pressed a hidden mechanical latch. A soft metallic click echoed through the room. Part of the floor quietly separated, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The underground chamber was surprisingly clean. Climate controls still hummed with quiet precision after years of faithful operation. There were no trophies, no medals displayed on the walls, no monuments celebrating victories. Instead, the room contained only a handful of carefully preserved belongings. A weathered black travel bag rested on a steel table. Beside it sat a plain photograph showing an older couple standing in front of a white farmhouse beneath a bright Kansas sky. Nearby rested a faded baseball glove, its leather worn smooth by countless afternoons. On the opposite wall hung a single dark gray jacket bearing no military rank, only a small embroidered earth flag over the left shoulder. Ethan picked up the jacket, running his fingers gently across the fabric before placing it over the back of a chair instead of wearing it. He opened the old travel bag next. Inside lay several neatly folded notebooks, a weathered compass, and a sealed metal case secured with biometric locks. The scanner recognized him immediately, releasing the lid with a quiet hiss. Nestled inside rested a simple silver identification badge scratched by time. There were no decorations surrounding it. Only one engraved line remained clearly visible. Ethan Carter, Earth Expeditionary Command. He stared at the badge without touching it. Above him, Hidden beyond layers of stone and marble, palace life continued almost normally. Children laughed in the gardens. Servants prepared lunch. Diplomats debated policy. Yet beneath the peaceful estate, a forgotten chapter of one man's life waited silently inside a room that had never been meant to welcome visitors again. Far beyond the atmosphere, another 7 unidentified vessels quietly entered observation range, joining the growing circle of watchers who seemed willing to wait as long as necessary for Ethan Carter to decide whether the door to his past would remain closed forever. When Ethan returned to the palace that afternoon, nothing about his appearance suggested he had just reopened a chapter of his life that had remained sealed for nearly a decade. He carried the same calm expression. He stopped to greet the gardeners tending the eastern flower beds. He thanked the cooks preparing dinner after accepting a small slice of fresh bread they insisted he taste. To everyone watching, he remained exactly the same man they had always known. Yet Princess Lysara noticed one subtle difference almost immediately. His eyes lingered longer whenever he looked toward the horizon, not with fear, but with quiet calculation, as though measuring distances only he could understand. By sunset, the Imperial Security Council convened once more. The newest intelligence reports filled the circular chamber with uneasy silence. 71 unidentified vessels now occupied neighboring sectors. Every captain continued refusing diplomatic contact. Every ship maintained perfect formation. Most remarkable of all, not a single vessel activated targeting systems or military shields. They behaved less like an invading fleet and more like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. One senior admiral leaned over the holographic projection with visible frustration. If they intended hostility, we would already know. If they intended diplomacy, they would have requested it. I have served 42 years, and I have never seen anything like this. An elderly historian sitting quietly beside the council table finally spoke. Perhaps we are asking the wrong question. The room turned toward him. Instead of asking what those ships want, he continued, perhaps we should ask whom they came to see. His words settled heavily over the chamber. No one challenged them. Across the palace, Ethan stood alone beneath the evening sky on the highest observation balcony. The breeze carried the scent of rain drifting across distant mountains while countless stars slowly emerged above Asterion Prime. Lysara joined him without speaking. For several minutes, they simply watched the first lights appear across the capital city below. Finally, she broke the silence. I found the old workshop. Ethan did not look surprised. I thought you might. I did not enter. He nodded gratefully. Thank you. She rested both hands against the stone railing. But I know there is more beneath it. Ethan remained quiet. I also know you have been protecting me from answers instead of protecting yourself from memories. He looked down briefly before smiling with gentle sadness. You always notice more than I expect. Then tell me one thing. She turned toward him. Should I be afraid? Ethan answered immediately. No. There was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Just one simple word spoken with complete conviction. Somehow that certainty calmed her more than any formal reassurance from the Imperial Council ever could. Before either of them could continue, every communication panel along the balcony illuminated at once with a soft blue glow. The palace announcement system activated throughout the entire complex. Priority orbital update, an artificial voice announced. An additional vessel has entered high diplomatic orbit under authorized civilian clearance. Chamberlain Varric appeared on the nearest display only moments later. His normally composed expression carried unmistakable disbelief. Your Highness, you should come to the command center immediately. Minutes later, the enormous orbital display revealed the newest arrival. Unlike every previous unidentified vessel waiting beyond the neighboring sectors, this ship had approached openly. It carried no hidden transponder, no military markings, only one small silver emblem recognized by almost nobody inside the room. Ethan quietly stepped closer to the display. His face remained unreadable. The historian sitting near the rear of the chamber suddenly stood so quickly that his chair nearly tipped over. His eyes widened as he stared at the silver emblem rotating above the holographic projector. That cannot be possible, he whispered. One of the younger officers frowned. Do you recognize it? The old historian nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the image. I have only seen that symbol in classified archives. His voice grew almost reverent. It belonged to the Earth Expeditionary Command. The organization officially dissolved 9 years ago. Every eye in the chamber shifted toward Ethan. No one spoke. No one even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. After a long silence, the incoming vessel finally transmitted a single encrypted communication. Palace computers decoded it within seconds and projected only one sentence across the center of the room. Commander Carter, your watch officially ended 9 years ago. We are requesting permission to stand watch for you now. Ethan closed his eyes for the briefest moment, and when he opened them again, the quiet warmth that had defined him since arriving on Asterion Prime remained unchanged. Yet for the first time, everyone around him realized they were no longer looking at an ordinary gardener who happened to marry a princess. They were looking at a man whose absence had been remembered across the stars long after he had chosen to forget himself. Silence remained in the command chamber long after the transmission disappeared from the central display. No alarms followed. No emergency countdowns flashed across the walls. The galaxy had offered neither a threat nor a demand. Instead, it had offered respect. For many inside the room, that was somehow even more unsettling. Princess Lysara looked toward Ethan, searching for the gentle smile that usually appeared whenever conversations became too serious. This time he remained thoughtful, his eyes fixed on the fading hologram of the Earth Expeditionary Command emblem. At last he spoke. They should not have come. The elderly historian slowly approached him. With respect, Commander, I believe they felt they had no other choice. Ethan shook his head almost imperceptibly. My choice was to disappear. Your choice saved many people. The historian replied quietly. History simply refused to let that choice erase your name. Ethan lowered his gaze. History remembers victories. It forgets the people who carried them. The old man smiled gently. Not always. Chamberlain Varek carefully cleared his throat before speaking. Mr. Carter, I believe everyone here deserves to understand why so many independent captains have crossed half the galaxy merely to confirm you are alive. Ethan remained silent for several moments. When he finally answered, his voice carried no pride, only quiet reflection. 9 years ago, the Earth Expeditionary Command was sent to evacuate civilian colonies trapped between several collapsing frontiers. We were not the strongest fleet. We were simply the closest. Every person in the chamber listened without interruption. Thousands of families were trying to leave before the transportation corridors failed. There were children, elderly citizens, medical workers, teachers, farmers, people who had never expected to become part of history. His eyes drifted toward the enormous window overlooking the stars. Our orders were simple. Hold the evacuation routes open until every civilian transport escaped. Lysara stepped closer without realizing it. Ethan continued speaking as though remembering each moment with perfect clarity. Many crews volunteered for assignments they knew they might not return from. Nobody argued. Nobody gave speeches. They simply did their jobs because someone had to. He paused before taking a slow breath. When the evacuation ended, more than 3 million civilians reached safety. The chamber remained completely silent. The command no longer had a reason to exist after that mission. The governments reorganized. Units were dissolved. Survivors returned home. The historian nodded. Most of them spoke very little about those days. Ethan offered a faint smile. That was intentional. We wanted children to grow up hearing ordinary stories instead of ours. Lysara finally understood something that had troubled her from the beginning. Ethan had never hidden because he wanted admiration. He had hidden because he wanted peace, not only for himself, but for everyone who had survived beside him. Then why are they searching for you now? She asked softly. Ethan looked toward the stars once more. Because someone convinced them I might have to stand alone again. Before anyone could respond, another transmission arrived from the vessel in orbit. This one contained no military codes, no strategic reports, and no classified information. Instead, the central display filled with hundreds of names arranged in neat columns. Men and women from dozens of worlds. Engineers, pilots, doctors, mechanics, communication specialists, rescue coordinators. Beside every name appeared the same short message: present and ready. The historian slowly removed his glasses, his eyes shining with emotion. They are volunteers, he whispered. Every surviving member who could reach this sector came anyway. Ethan stared at the list in complete silence. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the command table before slowly relaxing again. I asked them to build families, he murmured almost to himself. I asked them to leave all of this behind. Lysara gently placed her hand over his. Perhaps they did. Ethan turned toward her. She smiled with quiet certainty. Families do not disappear when life becomes peaceful. They simply become larger. For the first time since the mysterious ships had appeared, Ethan allowed himself a genuine smile. It was small, almost fragile, but it carried the warmth that had first transformed the palace gardens, the servants, and eventually the princess herself. At that moment, Lysara understood the truth that no archive or military record could ever fully explain. The galaxy had not spent 9 years searching for a legendary commander because of the battles he had endured. It had searched because, in the darkest moments countless strangers could remember, Ethan Carter had treated every frightened civilian, every exhausted crew member, and every forgotten soul exactly the same way he now treated gardeners, cooks, and children. He had never believed greatness came from being feared. He had always believed it came from making other people feel safe. Morning arrived with remarkable quiet. The unidentified ships remained exactly where they had been throughout the night, suspended like distant stars around neighboring sectors without crossing a single imperial boundary. Their discipline spoke louder than any declaration ever could. They had not come to conquer. They had come to honor a promise. Across Asterion Prime, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Markets opened beneath crystal towers. Children hurried toward their classrooms carrying bright satchels. Gardeners trimmed flowering vines that climbed the palace walls. The universe, for all its mysteries, continued moving forward one ordinary morning at a time. Ethan stood once again beneath the old flowering tree outside the royal residence, carefully watering the roots before inspecting fresh green leaves that had begun to appear during the previous week. Princess Lysara approached carrying 2 cups of coffee, smiling as she handed one to him. "You always return to the garden," she said. Ethan accepted the cup with quiet gratitude. Plants do not care who you used to be. They only care whether you remember to water them. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I finally understand why everyone likes you." He raised an eyebrow. "Only now. Before, I thought kindness was simply your personality." She looked toward the sunrise spreading across the lakes beyond the palace. "Now I know it was your decision." Ethan remained silent. She continued. "You could have spent your life asking the galaxy to remember everything you accomplished. Instead, you chose to become someone who repaired broken tools, greeted every servant by name, and built birdhouses with children." Ethan smiled faintly. Those things seemed more important. They were. The words came without hesitation. At that moment, Chamberlain Varric crossed the courtyard carrying a secure communication tablet. Unlike previous days, there was no urgency in his pace. His expression was peaceful. "Your Highness," he said with a respectful bow, "the unidentified vessels have begun departing." Lysara accepted the report. One by one, the distant ships were leaving their observation positions and returning to every corner of known space. None requested recognition. None asked for ceremonies or rewards. Their final transmissions contained only brief farewells, thanking the Asterian Empire for its hospitality and wishing Ethan Carter a peaceful future. The last message came from the Earth Expeditionary Command vessel, still resting in high orbit. It contained only one sentence. "You kept your promise. Now allow us to keep ours. Enjoy the life you earned." Ethan looked up toward the clear blue sky where the ship could not be seen with the naked eye. He quietly placed one hand over his heart before lowering it again. No speeches followed. None were needed. Several weeks passed. The palace gradually returned to normal. Diplomats once again debated trade agreements instead of mysterious fleets. Security patrols resumed ordinary schedules. The old storage workshop beneath the gardens remained locked, its hidden room undisturbed. Whatever belonged to another chapter of Ethan's life stayed exactly where he believed it should remain. One warm afternoon, Lysara found him sitting beside the lake, helping a group of neighborhood children launch small wooden sailboats they had built together during the week. Every boat floated differently. Some moved gracefully across the water. Others drifted in circles before gently reaching the shore. Ethan celebrated every launch exactly the same way, applauding each child regardless of the result. As the children ran laughing along the shoreline, Lasara quietly sat beside him. "May I ask one final question?" she said. Ethan nodded. "When you disappeared 9 years ago, were you afraid people would forget you?" He watched the tiny boats dancing across the gentle waves before answering. "I hoped they would." She looked at him with quiet surprise. "Why?" Ethan smiled toward the children chasing their little boats beneath the afternoon sun. "Because if they could forget my name, it meant they finally had the freedom to remember their own lives instead." Lasara rested her head lightly against his shoulder as the breeze carried the laughter of children across the water. In that peaceful moment, she realized the galaxy had been wrong about her husband from the very beginning. His greatest strength had never been the ability to command fleets or inspire legends. It had been something far quieter. He had shown an entire civilization that courage could become compassion, that service could become humility, and that the strongest human in any room might simply be the one who made everyone else feel safe enough to smile. Above them, countless stars waited beyond the daylight, silent witnesses to stories history would continue telling for generations. Yet the only story Ethan Carter truly wanted to live was the one unfolding beside him, where every new morning began not with medals or memories, but with coffee, gardens, and one gentle question spoken to the woman he loved. "Did you sleep well?"